All right, so just to introduce our guest today, this is Professor Andrew Mack. Andrew is a political economist, political analyst, policy analyst, teacher, filmmaker, and rock saxophonist. Andrew has a BA in economics from Flinders University, honors in political economy from University of Adelaide, and a doctorate from Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Sydney. His work had been published in a multitude of economic journals, with research priorities including investigation of the sources and impacts of economic crisis on systems and processes of regional organization in East Asia. Currently, Andrew is a senior research fellow in the Department of International Relations at Macquarie University and teaches as an adjunct professor with Boston University. Professor, it's an honor to have you on the podcast, and I'm excited to get started.
Thank you so much, Sam, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Just to get started, I'd like to hear a little bit about how your early life impacted your career choices, and more specifically, I know you've spoken a little bit about your experience in the wool and textile industry from as early as a teenager.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what that taught you?
Well, I got bad results in high school, and I couldn't go on to university, and I didn't actually believe I had the brains to do it. So I did a textile course in Geelong, which is a province or city near Melbourne, and it's part of the wool business that I grew up in. So it was a continuation of the idea of the wonders of wool and the production in Australia of fibres that are incredibly valuable on the world scene. So it was a really good opportunity for me to keep on with the wool business where I grew up and find out, how this fits in the world. But I just want to say, just a remark about that for students and people interested in career prospects, that one of my greatest failings, I think, is sticking around too long on a job that you've done it well, and you've been successful reasonably, and yet you hang on because you don't believe you have the brains or the aptitude or the initiative to get the hell out of there and find something that turns you on, because life is moving feast.
So did you feel a pressure to kind of figure out what you wanted to do?
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up in a family that had these aspirations that you got on the job path and you stuck to that path, and then you made a go of it. Now, the path that I was on was a very low income paying path, and it was very constrained. The opportunities were not that wide, but it was very entertaining for me. I loved it. And I worked, we'll get onto that later, I worked with government departments, and with the company I was with was the biggest private wool company in Australia. And I learned a hell of a lot, but after a few years you find if you've been there, and you should be prepared to split, and I wasn't prepared to split. And eventually I was forced out because I was getting politically supportive of the people around me who were treated pretty badly. It was a very paternalist family. And they believed that they were treating their people well, but it was patronising and it was inadequate. So I took their side, and the company didn't like my presence. So I was forced out, which was good. But I had this, as you say in your question, I had this connections with that early business of being in the textile trade with subsequent things that had happened.
Yeah.
Lucky I did split, because within 10 or 15 years that whole industry had collapsed. It was superpowered before by tariffs and protectionism, and the government that came in later on just wiped out that protection, so I wouldn't have had a job anyway. So that's that key to students, to be prepared for the flexibility. The global system is so shifting and changing, and you've got to be prepared. But I mean, in terms of that understanding of the usefulness of the ideas, I draw on the ideas of where I worked in lots of jobs. With my teaching, you might have noticed the connection. So the connection in the wool trade was, first of all, the role of the government was to protect the industry, which meant that it was highly inefficient and not resurgent. And also the role of the government was crucial in terms of, for example, the National Research Institute, called the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation. It's a government institution, incredibly wonderful and very supportive of private companies and how they went. So I learnt that role of the state is important. You know, the private company is important unto itself, but has to be working hand in hand, in my opinion.
And just to move off that point, you talked about how those early labor conditions and things kind of pushed you in a certain political direction. Can you speak a little bit to the state of labor regulation and the role of the state in that when you worked in the textile industry and how that kind of compares as it's progressed over time?
Yeah, well, the textile industry, because it was feather-bedded by government, was vastly inadequate in terms of representation of the people in the workforce. And these people were mostly from European countries that came to Australia, and they didn't have very good English, so they were treated reasonably badly. Most of the workers were women in the textile factories that I worked in, and their wages were low, and they did dull and repetitive work, and management just took advantage of that. And I just always learned that you need to have proper representation, and they didn't. The representative, the textile workers representative, was illiterate. It was ludicrous. So I thought I'd take a bit of a stand. Management said, look, you can't be both on management side and on the worker side. So bye-bye.
And did that coincide timeline-wise towards your move back towards education?
Not really. I suppose I still didn't believe that I had the brains and the capacity to go to higher education. But fortunately, we'd elected a federal government that was the Whitlam government, and that instituted free university. Imagine it, free university, and also a subsidy for you attending university. Not very much money, but enough to make you
to get by.
Get by. So I then took advantage of that to get into university. Now, I didn't have the proper qualifications, but the university allowed older people with some experience, and you had to prove yourself, to get by. After the first year, they say, I give you a tick, you're in, you can continue your higher degree, and that's how I went. But that actually happened after I'd worked in Canberra for the election of the Whitlam government.
Okay.
As you say, I worked with this prominent politician who was a friend of mine who was involved with anti-Vietnam War struggles, and he was a tough chap, very one of nature's.
Is that Secretary Young?
Young, yeah, Nick Young, incredible fellow, and very supportive of me. So he got me this job once I left the textile factory. And all of a sudden, I'm driving around in big white cars, chauffeurs. This is I had a dead-end textile job, and here am I in Canberra, the capital of Australia, getting a gig happening there. Well, after the election, I didn't have the wherewithal, the capacity to be a publicity officer, so I wasn't able to continue there with Mick. So I then went to get that degree, and then I got to start teaching out of that, a bit of teaching. But teaching's a come and gone, If I'm in the position that I need some money and there's an opportunity to teach, I love to do it. But I do like to get back into the practical stuff of private enterprise and see how things are going there and work in that. And subsequently I did do that, yes.
So it seems you used education as a tool to kind of fuel a passion that you knew you wanted to get into.
Absolutely.
A lot of times students enter college not necessarily knowing what that passion is. Do you think this idea that you need college to succeed is a fallacy, or do you believe you need it to succeed, but it's better to narrow down what your life choices are first?
It's a very hard one, Sam, and I've always argued with people before, particularly people who wanted to get a degree, that it's good to have some real world experience before you do it. But everybody needs a job, and you only get a job if you have a degree, so you're in a bind. But I do think it's important to have a real world experience. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you're out there, so you can juxtapose what you understand about the real world and what they teach you. And when I went and did an economics degree, I did sociology, I did philosophy and other study as well as it, because I wanted to broaden my understanding. But I realised the stuff they're teaching in economics is complete rubbish. Sorry, folks.
In a practicality sense or in a theoretical sense?
No, not in the theoretical sense. They were profoundly, the models were rigorous, the teaching was good, everything was laid out there. But the people like me who'd come a little bit older to university were saying, look, I was a salesman for International Harvester in the Middle East, and they're teaching me stuff about demand and supply in the marketplace, which is not what happens in the real world. So I started then to try and juxtapose it, and then I became involved with the political economy movement, which is then an Australian-wide movement, and started to organise a journal out of Adelaide, which is part of that background. But that's the thing, that students have got to look at the teaching, with no disrespect to the teachers, but if they go straight out of school and do all their theory and get a single-minded view of the world, it's good for that, what the job they do, but it has to be holistic, it has to expand and incorporate other elements to it. Philosophy, history, sociology, mostly history, I think.
I completely agree in the sense of a lot of times students even leave college and go work their first job, and it's as if they have to learn everything on the spot because nothing really applied.
Yeah.
So there is a true importance in branching out, whether it be in a club, whether it be just talking to people and gaining that real world experience in whatever sense of the word you may find it. From an early age, it seems like you found the value in that.
Yes.
How did that carry with you as you moved into the political field?
Absolutely bedrock. The only, in terms of its help for my understanding of the world and how people operate in it, it was just fundamental. But the trouble is, when you get in a serious job like later as a representative in the entertainment industry for the people working there, you're so dedicated to getting stuff happen that you can't reflect. It doesn't give you a lot of chance to reflect. And I don't know how to reconcile that. Night school was arduous, and my workload was such I couldn't really do a lot of that. And I had on my mind all the time, I want to do a doctorate. I want to do a doctorate when I get time down the track. But that's a very hard thing to do, to be able to reconcile your academic understanding of the world with your practical stuff, constantly making sense of it, which is why political economy was like a creed for me. It became like, well, that's fundamental. All the Adam Smith and Karl Marx and David Ricardo, all that history stuff is fundamental to my worldview.
And that history stuff's so important because I feel like a lot of times, especially in the finance and economic world, if you don't understand the patterns of history that have already happened, they're bound to repeat themselves in ways where if you don't see it coming, it can hurt you in your current job position, as we saw with the 2008 financial crisis, as we saw with the East Asian financial crisis. With a lot of these things, are patterns that occur that if you're not paying attention to the world around you and you're so focused and dialed in on one thing, then you don't see the wider picture.
Absolutely, and that's why you just have to keep your antenna up and just be thinking about that bigger picture stuff. And look, if I didn't have political economy, I'd be floundering, I think, because so much stuff happens. But if you stand back and reflect, in the industries I've worked in, the way they've changed, governments have been removed protection, or they've subsidised the film industry in Australia. Australia had a major film industry in the 1920s and 30s. One of the biggest in the world, but that completely collapsed under competition from other countries. But it's been resurgent in recent years because people appreciate it. But the state has played a really big part in that.
We're gonna start to move into all of your professional experiences, but just to rewind quickly, you said when you were in high school you didn't feel like you had the capacity for the higher education, and then you got to a point early on in your career where you're saying, I want to go get a doctorate.
That's right.
Where was the jump where you gained not only the confidence in yourself, but the kind of the desire to get that education?
That's a terrific question, Sam, and I don't really know the answer. I think it really helps it if you've got a tutor. Look, what we had in Australia, we have these tutors who run small groups, and I had a Cambridge woman who was very worldly in terms of that form of economics, and she was instrumental in getting you to think along certain paths. You really have to look out for people that can give you that edge up. I don't particularly like private tutors to do that. I think it's good to do it in a group.
Yeah.
But whatever you do, you have to be doing the reading, you have to do the background, make sense out of it. But fundamentally, and this just applies to everything, you have to be critical. You don't accept the stuff that's being taught you. That's why I say to you, mob, in this class, please, I'm happy whatever view you have in any background, but you must be critically assessing the material and say, that's crap or that's useful for me.
Yeah.
And then that helps the process.
That speaks to your success over the years. I know you've accomplished so much in the sense of you can't just regurgitate material that you've been given.
Yeah.
You need to develop a perspective on it. You need to push out your own material.
That's right. It has to be yours.
And so moving from that, we talked a little bit about your time with Senator Young.
Yeah.
You worked in a variety of governmental positions over the years, including advisor to the health minister. You have done work with the Attorney General of South Australia, and have had several leadership positions in the Australian Theatrical Amusement Employee Association. How have each of these experiences formed your understanding of government and the different layers of decision making?
Well, they've all informed it in different ways. I mean, for example, when I worked for the Federal Minister for Health, Neil Blewett, he was my professor at Flinders University in politics, and also had been involved with the moratorium movement against the Vietnam War. His attitude was a pluralist in political analysis system, which is a bit different from my political comment. But what his the reality of his job was, he was responsible first as what we call a shadow minister, or leading up to an election. If you're in the opposition party, then you're shadowing the person who's actually doing the job. So when he actually got the job, all of a sudden, we're dealing with bureaucrats, we're dealing with big pharma because it's the health ministry, we're dealing with lobby groups and pressure groups, and we're dealing with the people on the ground who felt affected by health. And I just found that task just completely, amazingly, staggeringly involved and heavy duty. It was so big, and it was just a couple of us in his office when he was shadowed, and then subsequently it blew out, so there was a departmental people around, and they were whispering in his ear and say, "This is the way to go, man, this is the way you must go." And the British come out with a program called Yes Minister, which is how bureaucrats influence the way you proceed and how you should have the gumption to stand up against them, because they've got these incredible departments and they have got all the experience because they've been in those jobs for yonks. And then you come as a new minister and you try to make things happen, and you're a bit stuck by the inflexibility of the bureaucracy. And that's the first lesson I thought has to be learnt, and how you get around it, fundamental.
So even once you might believe you're on a level field, there's a kind of an ingrained hierarchy that you need to abide by in the sense of experience level or just priority based on how long someone's been there.
Yes, that's right. That's right. The other lesson I learnt was, I worked in his electorate office, which means out mixing with the people. He had 17,000 people in his constituency. And I think I broke 3 telephones in that job. This is pre-mobile. Throw them against the wall, because they have all these multitudes of concerns, and people out there don't distinguish between, it's presumably the same in the States, between the local government, the state government, and the federal government. So they just come in with all these complaints and concerns. So Blewett would be in Canberra doing his work as minister, he'd come back and I'd have a line of people to see him. And
for in-person complaints?
Yes. And he, because he's a good man and connected with the people, he wanted to talk to them, make it sense, but you just 17,000 constituents. So the second major lesson was, do not slag off at politicians, whatever. You know, there's bad politicians and good politicians, corrupt or whatever, but by and large, these are people doing a damn hard job and have to get out there, both representing their constituency and then going on the federal stage, being on the TV, working in cabinet with their colleagues to make policy decisions. Biggest job on earth. Really is tough.
A lot of those hard things about it come from you get elected for a certain reason, and a lot of times it's harder to accomplish what you promise to accomplish than people think. You talked a little bit about lobbyists before.
Yep.
The role of lobbyists originally were to speak for people's concerns in a more organized fashion to higher government. That's kind of transformed into a way for corporations, especially in capitalist societies, whether good or bad, to promote policy that supports those corporations. How can we rebalance that effort, or can we rebalance that effort to be more towards?
Well, you've probably been going through the big pharma exercise, and you probably are better able to answer that to me. I don't know, Sam. I don't know how you do it. In this state, it was intensely corrupt in terms of developers lobbying and overriding regulations and just getting things by.
In New South Wales?
In New South Wales. And then the state premier said, no lobbyists, no developers can gain access to the ministry.
Yeah.
And that was one way, but it's top down. It's very, you've got to have a tough means of enforcing that. But it was successful because all of a sudden you see that the development is not going to the spivs and the corrupt, and the buildings are not falling down like they have in Sydney. They've just collapsed. You think, well, that was a common sense thing. But that depends on your cabinet, the capacity of your government to grasp that nettle and be involved with it. Now, I grew up in South Australia with the textile trade. I moved from a Melbourne factory to an Adelaide factory, and there's what, and the Premier was Don Dunstan. And fortunately, he was in a period of full employment, sufficient state reserves to do what he did. So the previous governments had run the state really well, but it was the state that was organising things with private companies and controlling how things went. For example, if the General Motors wants to set up a factory in the electorate that I was working in, then the government, provides them with the roads, houses, dormitory suburbs, transport mechanisms, and facilitations for aeroplanes or ports or whatever. They do that, set that up, the government runs in. So it's well ordered. The state was hand in hand, or if they didn't own the gas supplies and the electric supplies and the insurance companies, they certainly organised the private companies to run to suit the needs of the state. The state otherwise would have collapsed. Now this is conservative governments, not radical governments, that did this. So Dunstan inherited that incredible infrastructure, and he said, right, okay, you can't drink in the hotel. Sorry about this, Sam. For Americans who are under 21, is it? Yeah. You can't drink in the hotel after 6 o'clock. You can't drink on Sundays.
And what year is this for context?
70s. It was right up until he was elected in the late 60s, and it was in the 70s. So he came, and he's a bit of an Italian nut. So he had open restaurants, cafes, everybody on the pavements, glorious climate there, beach suburb, everybody's out there drinking and whatever, after the rules were changed. There were major attacks on the homosexual community. There was incredible misogyny in the system, and so he cleaned that up. So that didn't require a lot of money, it's just common sense. And I've wondered whether or not you can still do that if you want. There's another thing he did. He built a series of theatres around the state, which did require a lot of money. And I used to work in those in the theatre game. And this was magic for country people. Almost they didn't have to go hundreds of miles to the city. They were in there, and they were full theatres.
So he was putting these in more agrarian areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And there were 5 or 6 of them, I think. And this was...
And how did that yield for the actual theatres?
Oh, it was lovely. Everybody wanted to go and do stuff in the theatre. It was a people's
Because they probably didn't have much around.
No. Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about like the iron ore and shipbuilding companies of Whyalla, this is 4 hours from Adelaide. You're not going down to the cinema or the theatre from Whyalla and the Iron Triangle. And so he put a theatre there, full theatre with a fly gallery and the whole bit, and people love it. So we had touring companies like the opera company also worked on with them, and we toured up there. South Australian Theatre Company, we toured up there. People just came from everywhere to do that. But what I'm saying is another thing I learnt out of this is it's one thing to be top of the business cycle and spend like this to make these things happen. It's a bit more difficult when we get to the end of the long post-war boom and all of a sudden we've got stagflation. It seems to be starting to happen in America.
Yeah.
And we get this
8.65 inflation.
Yes. Well, it's starting to look slightly freaky. And we will get a connection in Australia. And so I was saying I interviewed Neil Blewett, who was Minister for Health, later on about the Dunstan regime. And I said, well, if the business cycle wasn't so good, would he have been able to do those wonderful things, build the state theatres and all that? And he looked at me like he had never thought of that before. But it's something you have to, as a politician, you have to see where's the money coming from, how can you most effectively spend it, and that's really crucial. You've got to make sense out of that. So that was another major lesson. So anybody that gets into the business of the bureaucracy or government or World Bank or any corporation really have to take account of those pressures and the state of the economy.
And speaking on that, and something you mentioned before, which was once you got into the political realm and saw how difficult the job was, you kind of gained a respect for politicians as a whole, even if you don't really align with their view.
Absolutely.
What do you believe the importance is of circumstantial critique? Because if you inheriting a good economy and be able to implement other policies that add on to just present circumstances is a benefit that not all leaders get, not all politicians get. What is the importance of digging deeper than just the surface level to really understand what a politician did in the circumstances rather than just overall?
Oh, absolutely important. And when I was doing that research for a couple of articles on Dunstan, I realised that hadn't happened. There wasn't an appreciation of that connection because the long post-war boom in Australia, as in America, you thought it was just going to go on forever.
Yeah.
But if you had political economy understanding, you say you'll get an appreciation that things will happen. You get the Asian crash, you get the global crash, and pandemic or whatever, and things happen.
Especially if you're investing heavy in heavy industry and manufacturing.
Absolutely. Yeah, my word. And it's just a constant lesson, but it doesn't seem to be learned very deeply. And I think this new government that's coming to Australia, too much of a push because it's the government that I certainly support as opposed to the previous one. They've got this big series of tasks dealing with China, dealing with the post-COVID resurgence, dealing with inflation, but also at the same time making sure that you've got the infrastructure going. I mean, with the floods in New South Wales in the last few months, and with the major fires that we had the year before, it's just catastrophic. That requires long-term consideration of what the hell are you going to do with all those people that live in the on the floodplain. So you live in hope, but I urge everybody that's interested in this stuff just to take a bit of a handle on, not just to slag off the politicians. Oh, they don't do enough, or but just to try and get your handle on it, get involved maybe as an intern with a politician, and you'll see this stuff.
It's interesting. You talked about not only the present government, the government prior, and kind of where you fell in that area. Have you kind of fine-tuned your political views over the years, where you may believe in something wholeheartedly, but that may adjust over time? A lot of times in America currently, there's a big divide in politics, obviously, and it's tough to have conversations on either side of the aisle. What do you believe is the importance in that constructive talk to be able to maybe even fine-tune your own views or make progress?
Nothing more important. I mean, there were times in Congress where they talk about reaching across the aisle and shaking the hand or connecting with the other mob. That seems to have gone, and I'm not sure what's happened. It's also gone a bit. Maybe social media has consolidated in terms of the hate stuff, but it's just fundamental. And I think the best eras in America are where Congress has been able to get a combined bipartisan approach to stuff. Who was it said that? It was Roosevelt, I think, said you should never go to war unless you have a bipartisan approach to it. It has to be, everything has to be considered about that potential. But how the hell do you get through this horrible period? I don't know.
Largely considered the greatest president of all time, Abe Lincoln purposely put people with opposing views, not only in his cabinet, but in the government positions around him. And so it's hard to believe, like, speaking to the fact that we do consider Abe Lincoln to be the greatest president of all time, why have we not followed that model in a sense?
Well, I think that it's a lot of the alienation of that economic chasm that has meant that people are not, the lives are not improving, and then they take on the renegade people like Trump to support them because they don't believe the swamp's going to do them any good. Congress is just a swamp of the people with their own vested interests. That's certainly understandable, and it's incumbent upon politicians and us all to go out there and talk to them. I mean, the PBS NewsHour that I constantly refer to in lectures is the case study, the perfect example of a national broadcast that does try to do it. It incorporates people who are arch Republicans, tries to get them to talk, work it through. It's not a style of Stephen Colbert, who never, you wouldn't get somebody from the other side on him because he's taken Chayek the Trumpist of it, and that doesn't help really. And there's a lot of stuff about New York I've been a bit horrified over the years, recent years since Trump got in. And that is the New Yorker and the Atlantic Monthly, and these journals are very righteous about how things ought to be, but they're not really into why things are as they are. They're not sending the journalists, or maybe they do, but I don't see it, out there to the Midwest, talking to the people. Now, there are some journalists that get out there. Michael, the documentary filmmaker, economist, Dancing at Columbine. Anyway, Michael Morra had these series of films, and he does get out and talk to the people, and he understands them because he's not a redneck. He's a basic chap of the people, and that has to be done. And we have to do it here in Australia. We have to get out there and just go to the local thing and talk to people, because all they want is a decent life, decent jobs, future, and security. And so you have the best media in the world, you've got the massive soft power of Hollywood, and you are appealed, your currency remains strong around the world, you're a great appeal for other countries, particularly developing countries who want to think about democratic opportunities. And yet this is a major gap that doesn't seem to be able to be addressed.
It's almost, you need to go back to a fundamental level of just, as we said, understanding and seeing the commonality between people as a whole, rather than trying to put yourself into one thing versus the other.
Oh, really?
That's why, like, even labeling Democrat, Republican, it's almost like an identity in the States, and it's become such a polarized thing. Instead, it's almost crazy to see someone that is a moderate. And I've got to say, sadly, the former Australian Rupert Murdoch has got a lot to answer for because he gets his wealth out of division. He set up his Fox thing to be a divisive, to get that element of the market under his belt, and that's been a major downfall, I think, in terms of that sort of information, let alone all of the other stuff about avoiding any morality and any principle within these editorialised positions. That's just appalling. I'm really embarrassed by this former Australia. But that's the way he goes, and you have to figure out what the hell you're going to do about it. Yeah, it's interesting to hear, and just deep diving into kind of the political aspect of your career, it's cool to think about how the fact that you were also involved in the film industry.
Oh, right, okay, yes.
How did that come about?
Oh, yeah, that's insane, absolutely insane. I have a beloved, dear friend that I sadly missed who was in this first Australian film, which was an absolute global sensation and still is, called Mad Max. It's a pretty horrible film, but I mean, he got incredible credentials as the tow card.
Oh, that's awesome.
On the one hand, the other hand, I was very fond of the work of Peter Brook. He did lots of films, he did theatre, he travelled around the world with his theatre company, with people of variety of cultural backgrounds, and I was very, very fond of his work. Now, he was coming to Adelaide, where I was working then, and set up in a band Macquarie.
And when is this about? Is this...
This is about 1980.
1980, okay,
Yeah.
so after your time.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So I was watching this being set up and interested in what the theatre was going to be, and then I got an inheritance from a family. The farm was eventually sold, so I got a bit of money out of that, and then I was teaching some Aboriginal and Indigenous people in my classes at the Institute of Technology then. And one of them mentioned that a friend of hers was travelling from Sydney in a bunch of motorbikes to come down with his mates with a bunch of motorbikes to make this film. And also that he was looking for a bit of money for this film on Peter Brook in the quarry. And I thought, wacko. Two members of my family were horrified because I threw this money at this film, not having any notion of making any money. You've got to do that in life, Sam, every now and again.
Take that risk.
Take that risk. I mean, I knew that the government had some tax advantage benefit, but I hadn't thought about that. I just saw that Hugh Keys-Byrne was coming down with his partner and wanted money, and I was going to give it. The money was previously pledged by a bunch of doctors. When they heard that Peter Brook was going to be talking to Aboriginal people about dance and land rights, they pulled their money out. So I put my money back in and made this film with them. And then from then on, I became close friends. And I worked in Canberra, so I'd go via there in Sydney, in their old mansion. There were actors and poets and musicians. It was just a complete blast. And now I go into Canberra for a straight job and then come back via there. And we've been very close, and Hugh and I and the crew made 5 movies. These are wacko movies. They're not mainstream. They are very badly received, but they are artistically quite interesting, but sort of avant-garde, a bit weird. And one major one, we got a certain amount of money from the government, I don't quite know how, and Hugh was the lead in that. And so that became a bit of a thing of mine, that as an extra arm, because I love these people and love the way they did stuff as a collective.
Yeah.
A lot of crap, a lot of rubbish film, but you had a hell of a fun doing it, you know.
And you kind of just deep dived right into that industry. What was that learning curve like?
Vertical.
Yeah.
Vertical. So, you know, when I what's the sequence? Yeah, well, I left Blewett. It was all too hard. I was working, 12, 13-hour days, and it wasn't satisfactory because I wasn't a publicist, and you wanted a publicist. As a minister, you want a publicist, so we parted ways. And then I was unemployed for a while, and then my friend, who's a former Attorney General, got me this job with the Theatrical Workers Union. It's the film, television, cinema, race courses, anything to do with entertainment.
And does this have connection with the government, or is this?
No, this is a private union. Subsequently amalgamated with the journalists and the actors to become the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance. At the end of, I was there for 11 years or something. But when I got into that, the vertical learning curve, even though I associated with some of that theatre and was a big theatre going, interested in movies, to learn about the needs of cinematographers and cameramen, people in Channel 9, Channel 7 or wherever, and the struggles they had to try and get fair working conditions and fair wages, it was just very difficult. So in Australia we had this system called conciliation arbitration, which you go in and you try and negotiate with the employers to get a fair deal. You know, when you're in a helicopter being flown over the TV channel to make promos of the TV, you want more than just a rope to tie you into the cockpit, you know. You need a decent harness.
Yeah.
Whereas they just had bits of rope. So you have to do this stuff. But these industries are so ununionised that you'd have these incredible difficulties. I mean, the employers were so tough. I got into Channel 9 one stage, and then I was escorted off the premise with a guy with a gun. I thought, this is going a bit far. This is democracy. The right for people to assembly is built into the ethos of the country. But no, they were so. But when the management started to realise that I didn't have horns on like the devil, and that I was a bloke you could talk to and maybe have a drink with in the bar, you know, then we started to make stuff happen. But it was a long journey, vertical learning curve.
So that's still a connection back to your passion for assisting with the labour.
Yeah, absolutely, all the time. I mean, you can't hardly sleep, you know. You go down to the green room and have a drink with the backstage workers because they're, you know, out of it and everything all the time because they work in such shifts.
So that's been in your mind throughout the
all
process,
the time,
even during your time in private industry.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the fact of something you're truly passionate about.
Absolutely, I'm very passionate about it, and you grow and change, and you mix with certain people who take another view, and then eventually you go, I love you dearly, but I can't go that way. I've got to go this way, my own way. It's a struggle, and you have trouble with friends, but that's the way you got to go. And I don't know where it came from. I don't think my parents were particularly Labor-minded. I'm sure they voted Conservative. But my mother was very much into encouraging outward thought and being critical. So if you have that inbuilt capacity, then you see somebody treated badly, you know, and some management might say, well, that's the game. You say, no, that's not the game. The game is used to make sense out of it, make fairness prevail. Now, I'm sure that America's full of people that share that same sentiment. And, you know, it's just part of a good life for me.
At that point, you're in the film industry. Do you have your PhD yet, or when do you decide to go back and do it?
No. The film industry, as I said, the union amalgamated with the other unions, and it became a bit elitist. And I thought they were losing touch with the people on the ground, because actors, equity, and journalists are a bit high-flowing people. Whereas the people that work as cleaners or backstage workers are regarded as a bit lumpen, you know, blue collar. Even the cinematographers, the top cinematographers in the world, are regarded as not the same as an actor. You know, Jack Thompson or Kylie Minogue or somebody, it's not the same. So I felt that I've done the dues, and I'll split, and I'll be unemployed for a while, but I'll do some more learning. I'm at the stage of my life. So I got some mates at Adelaide University who are involved with political economy to start doing stuff on East Asia. So I split from Australian political systems. I've done a lifetime of it and thought I'd concentrate on East Asia.
And what made you pinpoint that?
Yep.
How'd you fall into East Asia?
Well, as a kid, I went to Indonesia when I was 10 with my father. We were both ill, and we got this trip, 3 months.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with the whole thing, and I'd been going to Indonesia when I could, or East Asia, and I thought, okay, I'll put my academic and intellectual exercise, because I realised that Indonesia, under the dictator Suharto, things were pretty cruel, pretty bad. And I did a trip over there with some industrial relations people, and we talked to people in various factories, and I thought, well, years ago, I'll do a doctorate on the way in which labour has been instrumental in colonial Dutch East Indies and in post-colonial Indonesia, and see how that rhymes. I didn't really have it, and anybody doing a doctorate, you do change your direction a bit.
Yeah.
You've got a cause, but you must constantly be prepared that life evidence will cause you to shift. But that's what I did, and it took me nearly 7 years.
Yeah. But that's a good thing, is being able to kind of progressively push yourself into like funneling it down to the specifics of what you want to do. And it's interesting to hear, like, a lot of people believe they have to plan out their whole life by the time they're 18, and you kind of let your journey take you where it took you, and you ended up successful in many different facets.
But I did need the money, Sam.
Yeah. No.
I mean, I did do jobs like forklift driving or working on the roads.
And it's that balance that's it's vital to find.
Yeah.
Where you need to know that the imminent future is coming.
That's
I
right.
need to make money.
Yeah.
But
being dictated by money, or the job for the sensation of it or the sexiness of it, it's never been really a big driver for me. I mean, it's nice to drive around in big white cars and have chauffeurs and all that stuff, but it's not the deal.
Yeah.
It's not the deal.
And overall, so throughout this interview, we've kind of been able to discuss the variety of fields you had a foot in.
Yeah.
I also know you're an avid rock saxophonist. I actually got a chance to see you perform, which was wonderful. Given your involvement in all these different kind of things, how are you able to maintain a healthy work-life balance over the years, and how has your understanding of what that is changed?
Well, I haven't really. I mean, in Adelaide, when I was mouldering a bit, I was in a couple of big bands and in a woodwind quintet, and we played gigs, and it was gorgeous. But when I came over and I got some teaching, and I did my doctorate, I was teaching in a couple of universities, and the city's so damn big, it's very hard to organise that, so I lost that musical thing.
Yeah.
But therefore, it was such a joy to come to Boston here and work with my friend Professor Stillwell and start with just the two of us. About 10 years ago, did a bit of a gig for the students, and then it grew out of that because I thought the students might have musical abilities, which we always get a couple. So that, I'm not really rock and roll, I love it, but it's not been my musical background. I just do what I can, I blast it out, and I'm backed by my wonderful backing mob, and I wouldn't be anything without them, absolutely.
And the fact that it's a hobby even kind of speaks more to what I'm getting at, is the importance of things outside of work.
Yeah.
Obviously work is important, and one of the main reasons I'm doing what I'm doing here is try to help people figure out what work they want to get into.
Yeah.
But the importance of also finding what you want to do outside of work is vitally important, because you only really do have one life.
Yeah.
And I think you've definitely taken advantage of that.
Yes, I
in a
have.
lot of ways.
Life chances have been good, but you've got to have your antenna up, as I said, to run for it.
Yeah.
I came to Sydney and I was just bereft of music, so I started doing a bit of stuff at the Con Jazz Night School. It was too hard. Worked with some big band for a while, and that was too hard to get the time available.
Yeah.
So, when the chance to play a bit of rock and roll came, I ran for it.
Definitely, you took that risk.
I took the risk. Yeah, that's the life, isn't it, Sam?
Yeah.
Taking a damn risk and getting out there and having scary. Can be really scary, particularly if you don't have the confidence and belief in yourself enough that you can just jump. And I didn't over decades, I didn't. And that's a big life lesson I finally learned. So here am I, happy here with Boston. It's glorious. I've got everything, because
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
I've got the chance to do a bit of teaching when there's no COVID around, and do my music, and do writing and articles. I'm on the Ebbett Foundation as a 4th president of the United Nations. I'm on the foundation that recognises his legacy, and I write stuff for them, So it's just joy.
Yeah. No, that's great. Especially hear that you're truly enjoying what you do.
Hell, man, I couldn't. I've just been so hanging out during the COVID to get back in front of you people. Even with my age, I don't feel weary.
Yeah.
I just want to run it.
Well, at this point in the interview, I like to kind of take a step back and ask a few questions that me and some of my team were wondering that kind of apply to your specialty.
Yep.
So I'll probably hit you with a few kind of
Absolutely, try it on.
high level
Yeah, try
bigger
it on,
questions, but I just want to hear your perspective. So the People's Republic of China's Belt and Road Initiative, as many people know about, has prompted certain economists to believe that while the program is supposed to benefit developing countries, it may actually deprive these nations of their means of economic competitiveness as well as economic freedom. Do you believe that this initiative is a threat to growing nations, or do you truly think it will stimulate economies of Southeast Asia and the Middle East?
Great question. I think it's a mix, and evidence just constantly coming out. At the early stages, there were a bunch of theorists and analysts who were saying this is a horror. These countries are getting tied into debt dependency with China, and China is therefore being able to manipulate them and get it to do what it wants. But it has to be said that this is proven to be slightly inadequate in understanding, because several countries who have been tied into the Belt and Road have challenged China's dominance, or the projects have collapsed, but they're not paying back the debts. So they've determined to have that bit of sovereignty. So it's left China in a bit of a position, but all in all, a difficult position. But all in all, the ambition for China to do this thing, which now America and the allies of America are wanting to duplicate, shows how important I think it is to spread the wealth and the opportunities through trade and demand for Chinese goods without becoming colonised by China in the process, and not converting their traditional handicrafts or production to high-tech goods from the China production machine. And that's a hard ask, and it really depends on the character and the strength of those regimes. I mean, it's very much more easy for China to manipulate, say, Pakistan than it would be to, say, manipulate one of the stand countries, I think. I'm not close enough to it, but I believe so. So it's a mixed bag, and young Chinese scholars that are studying in Sydney University have showed me their research, which is largely disparaging on the lines that you suggest. Debt trap, political control, military presence and that sort of stuff. And we have to be well aware of it. And I think America is very well aware of it, and its capacity to be able to both reconcile the appreciation that many countries in the region are very pro-China because what they think they can get out of it. Very many other countries are anti-China, and America has to reconcile that from the Pacific being an American lake to being Pacific appreciating that China will have its movement around that lake. I don't think it's got world ambitions. I think it appreciates America's capacity in terms of the security apparatus and has lived off it for years, and it appreciates the good trade potential, which was stuffed up a bit by Trump. But you know, this is a big, huge country, 1.4 billion, so that it could swing either way. You just have to keep our eye on it.
Yeah.
But all in all, I had dinner last night with a Chinese chap, a professor from Sydney University, and he was so scathing about China. He was saying this is an awful regime and he will manipulate you and watch out for him. And I said, well, you're not very positive about your homeland. There's various divisions, but there is that thing that internally it could implode if enough people believe that, and that would be a bit of a fright for the world.
There's a lot of that questioning right now, especially about the stability of their economy. It was actually, Bloomberg put something out today that there's potential for approximately 50 billion in mortgage defaults.
Is there really? So it agrees with his sentiment that it's a bubble.
Yeah, right. And overall just pushing out bad credit, overstimulating the economy with money that ultimately won't result in much for the government. I mean, it's not as black and white as it sounds. It's a complex issue.
Absolutely.
But it's good to hear your perspective on it. Secondly, probably not slowing down, probably a couple more hard-hitting
Yeah,
questions.
run it. See how we go.
Second question is, while Reaganomics and popular uninhibited market stances of the 1980s promoted that economic growth comes through a lack of government intervention, you tend to state that there is a definitive need for government as a benefactor to corporations as well as citizens. What is the benefit, and what do you believe was the role of Australian government in developing of the domestic economy?
Yep. Well, on the latter part, we wouldn't have Australia if we didn't have the state organising infrastructure, land passing out, money, organising the money, all of that stuff. So that actually adds into the general notion that the question is a little bit skewed to the notion of state or non-state engagement in the economy, and it's and from Adam Smith's times, it's quite clear the state has always played a fundamental role, even though it's not recognised. And when we go through Reaganomics, as you said, or Thatcher economics, monetarism, or whatever, in Australia, economic rationalism, it's really amazing to me that you have this mystique that you can somehow disengage the state from capitalist accumulation. My doctorate proved time and time again that if you don't have the state engendering activity, the economy will collapse. The Dutch East Indies nearly collapsed several times. Mass poverty, starvation, it's just, it seems to me to be a fact of life. So having that as a starting point. Now, if you're saying beyond that, the role of the state, well, my experience in terms of the Australian government, as I said, if you didn't have the CSIRO, the research institution I used to work with, associated with the private sector, you wouldn't have had Australian wool industry being so successful as it is. Its inventions, its innovations, and similarly with Brambles and the ownership of the CHEP, which is a pallet which you put stuff on and put it on trucks or vessels or whatever. It's a CHEP. It's $1 billion industry. It was invented by government officials in Australia in order to facilitate transport of goods. And it's an international standard now, and the profits have been not back to the Australian people, but it's gone to Brambles. And that's disappointing, but that's the fact of it, and that's what happened. But things like what we've got, the national broadband network here, we needed a national mechanism of communication that was reasonably high speed to go to the vast distances of this country with nobody out there much. Occasional farmer or whatever. This is a big spot. Most people live on the eastern seaboard. So if you have a national broadband network, you need to get capital coming in. And I remember the first time it was raised as a proposition, and on the TV there were about 4 communication network private company officials, and they all shaking and said, oh no, we can't put money in this, oh it's too risky, we couldn't do it. And I thought, what? You know, this is something that should happen. The profits wouldn't be immediate, they'd have to be down the track. So it took the state required to generate its own company to do it. That's the same in South Australia when I was there with the Dunstan Nation. I mean, the gas companies didn't supply the city of Adelaide of their own bat. The government had to set up a gas company to do it. The building companies didn't automatically provide accommodation for Ford and General Motors workers. The government had to institute these suburbs. So it's just, to me, a fundamental hand-in-glove mutual engagement thing. The problem is, of course, if the state intervenes to the extent that it strangles opportunity. I mean, that's squeezing out. Yeah, and you have to have a government that works through that and makes sure it happens. But if you look at Singapore, Alan McCormack, who's addressed the class, who was an investment manager in Singapore for all those years, said that, well, you know, the family gets a lot of the deal. It's a crony regime, but Singapore was up there with Switzerland in terms of its harbour for financial management. It's just a superior city. All the trains run on time, there's no graffiti. It's a tough regime. Don't chew gum in public, you know, you go to jail. It's a tough regime, but it's been highly successful. Public housing, education, 3 universities, all this stuff has been what the Singaporean state has done for the last 40 years. And to me, that has to be the hand in glove that makes things happen.
The blend between private.
The blend between private and public enterprise, and be damn careful about it, because like we have these massive underground tunnel highways, pay highways. They've been organised between the government and private enterprise, public-private projects. And these companies have been creaming off Sydney workers. It costs you a huge amount of money to get from one side of the city to the other. And if you're working in a travelling enterprise, it's just diabolical. So the government should be stepping in and demanding that those profits didn't know they could be going back there. The costs should be reduced in terms of the patrons of the place. So those stuff has to be constantly worked at. But if you talk together with tripartite way, with the bureaucracy, with the government and with the private corporations, you can make sense out of anything.
Yeah.
In my belief.
And yeah, it's interesting to hear, because you definitely acknowledge that there is a balance.
Yeah.
But understanding the role of government, whether you agree with it or not, and understanding the actual mechanism is important to understand the reason why it's in place.
Yeah.
The third question is considering globalization. Globalization has been a self-reinforcing and exponentially growing process ever since the development of the original Silk Road over 2,000 years ago. This has made it increasingly difficult for isolationist politicians to implement their strategies without damaging economic growth. Do you believe that there is a way to successfully run an isolationist economy in the 21st century, or has the importance of foreign markets become too large for the major economies of the world?
Well, you have to live with the possibility and the hope that you can get goods around the world through globalised mechanisms, but hand in hand with the government's capacity and at odds with the World Trade Organisation, who've got tentacles to control this, to make sure that you've got sovereign rights to determine jobs, opportunities, independently of the big multinationals who are incredibly powerful. So they can move into Africa or whatever and buy off governors and provinces and do their deals, and to the vast disability of the populace. So that's the problem of democracy, Sam, isn't it? Being able to get a voice of the people. And I don't know how you reconcile it. I don't know if it's possible to have an international institution that could oversee it. I'm sure that the original planners for Bretton Woods, Maynard Keynes and co, would have an idea. But the way that globalisation has meant these corporations are bigger than the GDP of nations, you know, it's a very hard question to reconcile. And people I know that have tried to do it in this country are constantly banging their heads against the brick wall. But if you get a government like is more concerned about that, maybe a government that wants to take on the needs of the Trump's constituency, but not from a Trump position, then you might be able to do some sort of deals.
But that capacity to be self-sustaining and isolationist largely comes from the already established ability of the economy. So like America might have that production capacity to do so, but growing economies largely need a globalized network.
Absolutely, yes.
So the role of that in developing nations in East Asia, do you believe that it's largely beneficial in a globalized fashion, or do you think it can actually leave them vulnerable?
Well, both. It can leave them vulnerable, but to all intents and purposes, it has to be a good thing. Our historical lessons of the Great Depression, post the Great Depression, where isolation, insularity reigned supreme. Yeah, and you get hyperinflation in Germany. You've got international markets stymied. No, not good. So again, it's the question of your sovereign capacity to balance the needs of your constituency, but also to maintain open borders.
And it's largely in the hands of like the World Bank to actually facilitate these.
Well, yeah, they should be playing a major role. I mean, the crisis we've been in should really rejig. It's starting to happen a bit. I mean, the World Bank's a lot better than the IMF. There's been some wonderful people working in them, like George Stiglitz has been working with the bank over the years, and very good, positive-minded, principled people. And there it is. It's the possibility of that happening that you've got to be concerned about. But I mean, these institutions they were set up in a period where Europe was the domination of the world. Therefore, the tigers of Southeast Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan and Korea, were marginalised. And these were massively growing economies, but they didn't have any voice in these international institutions. Yeah. That's appalling. And it has to be redressed. And these countries must have a greater say. Otherwise, as we'll see in class, they go their own path, which leaves us quite on the back foot. Yeah. Because this is the citadel, this is the crucible of wealth generation in the world. It's not Africa or South America. It may be down the track, but presently it's in this region.
Yeah. And that kind of transitions to the next question of soft power.
Excellent.
And how not only America, but other major economies, other major political powers have used soft power to grow their economies further. What do you believe the role of soft power is in the modern economy, especially with America?
Well, America is the arch successful leader of the idea of soft power, because I said we have visitors from what is it? Sorry.
No, you're fine.
But the soft power is a fundamental way of international appeal. This is why America retains such a powerful position, why people regard the idea in the Ukraine-Russia war now, the idea of democracy and freedom as per the principles that you've espoused and promoted, occasionally unsuccessfully, but nevertheless the country is renowned for that. And China has tried to catch up. It's really on the back foot. I mean, it's got a 2,000 years history of culture, so it could be wonderful as a promoter of soft power, but it hasn't been able to exploit it adequately.
Given that we're a little bit cut for time,
yep.
I'll speed it up to my last question, and just something I ask every guest. What is one piece of advice you would give to students my age, or really anyone that is hoping to gain a better understanding of how to find their ideal career path?
Well, maybe it's two generalists, and I'll give you two. First of all, the flexibility, the capacity to have the willpower and the motivation and the intellectual energy to be able to shift, to move to another spot if it's not satisfying you, or if you think the advantages are. So the flexibility, the learning process must incorporate that element of flexibility within your persona, so that you've got the capacity to job, like I did, between jobs, vastly different sorts of jobs. That's, I suppose, selling power, your CV, your curriculum, your what do you call it?
Curriculum vitality.
Your promo, your bio.
Yeah.
Get your bio out and tighten it down. That's fundamental. The other thing that's fundamental is, and that's associated with flexibility, once you get a job of substance and meaning, don't stand still, don't let it vegetate around you. Keep the brain cells, those little grey cells, spinning around and make it your life meaningful. And I suppose that goes back to your early stuff about life, leisure, balance. And that's got to be part of it too, otherwise you're watching that damn clock at a job, which is so, I've been through so many jobs with that, it's so soul destroying.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Split.
So just to end things, it's just reiterating that part of take that risk, figure out what you want to do through the experience.
Yep.
And you'll end up all right. I appreciate your time.
Okay,
Thanks,
and congratulations on the initiative. I think it's a wonderful thing to do, and I hope it works very successfully. I'm sure it will.
I appreciate it.